there live at some point to bring you the latest. We're also waiting to hear whether the chair of the IEBC, Wafula Chebukati, has any announcement. Remember, after the 8th of August, we had quite a series of updates, which seem to be missing this time. But we'll come into that even with the panel that we have. But let me come to you, Dr. Mkhwana. And what we're looking at before we crossed over to Kitui is whether we have a revolution, politically speaking, as from moving from the ethnic narrative, or we are still there, especially given that I think majority of our voters is from 18 to 35, which comprises of the youth. But when we look at the voting patterns, even based on this last election yesterday, it looks like we're still largely thinking in terms of tribe.
I mean, what more would I add, Michael? You got it right. And that's why I was getting a bit bemused, my brother here, when he was insinuating that the young people are bringing a kind of change and revolution in time thinking as far as political orientation is concerned. I do not think so. And he knows, because if you just venture into the social media, where not so many people of Alutalala's age are active. Correct. I try, but that's not really my hotbed. I mean, the insults, the political bile is so monstrous, you can't believe these are young people in whom we have entrusted our future when we are long gone. Look at the much-touted young leadership, the digital leadership.
The same ones who were fighting yesterday.
The same fellows who were fighting yesterday and shouting insults in front of our children on national TV.
Obscenities.
And that, in fact, Michael, as media, you ought to black out those kinds of fellows. Because the moment that fellow who is fighting each other has followers. And the moment that happens on TV, there is a ripple effect down there. So I do not think, and I do not want to belabor this point, that our youth have rightfully adjusted to the challenge. And we had one of their leaders here yesterday morning, if you remember, Nerima Wako, who actually concurred and said that the youth aren't moving the direction we hoped they would, because we believed that the youth would change this country. Absolutely. Right from the leadership. Believe you me, elderly leadership up there is much more reasoned, much more cautious, and takes aboard each and everyone as they move. The energy that comes with the youth in this country ought to be directed in a way that will help us leave behind a country that we want to be proud of.
Javas, I don't know if you are in that category of the youth, but even if you're not, I'm sure you're not very far off. Where is the disconnect? What is the problem? Again, given that this youth that we're talking about, majority of them don't even speak their mother tongue. Some of them don't, especially in the urban areas. Yes. And those are the very youth that Dr. Mkhwana is referring to who are online. But if you look at the online conversations, they are literally embarrassing to say that you're Kenyan. What is the issue?
I must dispel your speculation. Of course, I am young still, and still a youth.
Well, I was just being safe.
All right, and that's why I still chair the youth agenda of Kenya. Correct. But as to the place of the youth and tribal issues in our politics, even though some may try to indicate that maybe we are moving forward, we are on a political treadmill, that we seem to be running, but we are actually at the same point. So as to the place of the youth and as to whether they're taking this country forward from that, tribal politics, it is worrying that even though we've spent all these years through civic and political education, it is clear that the anthropological instinct to belong to certain small groups or the quarters of ethnic extraction and taking pride in that seem to be the propeller factor in our politics. And the youth do not stay in a vacuum. We do not stay in a vacuum. We're in this country. And look, has it not been said to us that monkey see, monkey do? So when young people are growing under the tutelage and armpits of older politicians and leaders, and they see that those older politicians are benefiting from milking tribal politics, the younger people would see that actually to become a better politician, then maybe you need also to circle the teats of tribal politics, that it may fatten you. And we have seen it. And even though we seem to be fattening from the milk of tribal politics, one thing we learn from the animal kingdom, especially the example of dogs, is that however much you try to fatten dogs, their legs never fatten. And that's why in our politics we remain at the same place. And that is worrying. I don't know what kind of solutions maybe the future times will grant us, but that will leave to that time. But looking at the exercise and the conduct of my fellow citizens during this election, one, while there are losers and winners, speaking clearly onto the, how the elections took place yesterday, I know very well that if there is a man that is riding on the crest of pride and happiness, maybe it's Raila Odinga. And maybe in very many months, last night perhaps, he slept the most. Because maybe he realized that he made a call and it seemed to have been heeded. But that may not necessarily be the hard fact on the table. Do you know that the political history of this country has demonstrated that many Kenyans do not rise up to go and vote for someone? Kenyans are in the incessant habit of voting against something. Look, just by the absence of Raila Odinga on the ballot, it may not have motivated people even in central Kenya enough to come out in sufficient numbers and vote for Uhuru Kenyatta.
Because they thought it was an automatic win.
Yes. And so it's easy for many to vote against something. And even in Luo Nyanza, just because there was nothing to vote against, it did not enthuse them. And of course, their political supremo had spoken to them. And they heeded that call. So the lack of a reason to vote against someone, not for someone, but against someone, was not motivation enough for numbers to come out. But much more still, there is the political fatigue. Whether you look at it from Mandera, whether it is in coastal region, in Kilifi and Kwale, whether it is in Western Kenya, there is growing political fatigue. That even if we're to grant ourselves 90 more days to prepare for a fresher election, because this one was fresh, maybe even fresher, that still that fatigue would throw its hands around our shoulders. And we will not see numbers as huge in turnout as those that we saw on August the 8th.
All right, Charles, let's just speculate here a little bit, because that's, that's what analysts do, and try to see how things play out. Political and the environment, the fatigue that Kenyans are experiencing right now. Should there be an annulment of this election and we go back to the polls, are Kenyans really ready to do that? Or have we reached a point where we're like, you know what, I think we need to move on with our lives, indicated by the fact that today being the 27th, most people are actually going to work as though nothing happened yesterday, which was not expected before. Or are we at a point where we still feel we need this justice to a point we're still ready to go if another election would be called?
One thing we need to appreciate is that we are still a nascent democracy, and we're not yet there. So in terms of measuring our civil behavior and politically how we behave, we are still at a very low level, and we are still growing. So if the unthinkable happened today and it was annulled, number one, I know there's going to be a lot of fatigue, especially on parts of Kenyans, because they'll feel that this thing has protracted far too long. That is number one. But importantly, is that when I began, I said that this vote was a vote for stability and also a victory for constitutional order. If today there was that thinking that we are now going to annul an election for the second time within a very short time, I assure you that the form of resistance we are seeing that has even crystallized into an organization in itself will cease being sectional and it will become national. Because now people will feel that we are captive to a political class that has held us hostage, and they are not really allowing us to function as we should in our normal livelihoods. So going forward, I think it is in the interest of the country that we get closure to this matter, and anything else that should come should really be addressed within that continuum of stability and having dispensed with the elections. So the tricky part is just maneuvering now the feeling that there is a part of the country that feels disenfranchised by this exercise, that they never took part, they never participated. Of course, it was a choice, it was political, but they feel that it's not legitimate. But going forward, it is a realization that voting in Kenya is participation in elections is voluntary. It is never forced. So going forward, this election was important to assure continuity, stability, and constitutional order in our country.
Dr. Mkwana.
Yeah, Michael, Charles keeps on repeating this statement that this election was a vote for stability and constitutionalism. I do not know on what premise that is hinged, because I also think that even those who did not turn out to vote, the same can be said. because they did not just wake up and say they're not going to vote. They had constitutional, legal, and justice issues that they raised, which, in my view, and as I've heard before, were not adequately addressed. I have felt they ought to have been addressed. But that is an interesting jurisprudential concept it seems to be veering into, which I do not think we have enough time. The point I would like to emphasize, Michael, is that those who did not vote had grievances. We came to 26 because we agreed that now that the election had been called, constitutionally so, and per the Supreme Court dictate, let's have it and put it behind us. But that has not solved the problem that brought us here. Indeed, you said yesterday yourself that this election hasn't solved the problem that they're facing the country. So I think Charles ought to have a bit of a clearer vision on that one, as a younger brother, that today, even as we sit here and wait for the declaration and possibly the swearing in, that is just the beginning of the national dialogue that we must have as a country. Waswahili husema ndio mkoko unaanza kualika maua. Bado, kakangu. Ambalo tutafanya, what we shall do is this, that those who did not vote and now they have formed the NRM must be given a space to articulate what is it as nations of this country they feel that was not done right. And President Uhuru Kenyatta, once he's sworn in, he must not think that he has just been sworn in by Jubilee. The seat he's going to sit in, despite all this hullabaloo, is a seat as a head of state, not as the head of Jubilee.
Correct.
So he has the task now to sit back as the elder of the country now and ask, what does NRM want?
Okay, before we project onto where we are headed, let's still look at the elections. And one of the things that has come up is Chebukati has already announced that apparently the voter turnout is 48%, which is already being contested. And if we did simple arithmetic looking at the turnout, there's already questions being asked. Javas, are you happy with 48% turnout, which would be quite a huge number given that there was boycott?
The conduct of our politicians and every participant in this election would make me the lesser happier man. And that is why I would not rush to consider myself happy in a state of lesser happiness, though we pursue it. Now, Chebukati has spoken and said that he estimates 48% voter turnout. In a country such as ours, 48% voter turnout should not actually make us rest on the couches of calm and say that our country then should easily move forward. We must not. Because if 48% have turned out to vote, and that vote, of course, the huge part of the percentage would go to President Kenyatta, then how about the other half of the other voters? They may not necessarily belong to the kingdom of Raila Odinga, but a huge number again would belong to his kingdom, and then others who elected to abstain. That part of the country must not be left behind. That other percentage of voters should not be left behind. And that is why this morning, reason is my religion, and I intend to dwell in there without departing from such quarters. That reason demands that we tell President Kenyatta, time has come where you must summon a round table, not of the entire team of NASA and the surrogates of the NASA leadership. Sit with Raila Odinga.
And with him sitting with Raila Odinga, does he realize he would be sitting with the nation?
Well, the nation will be sitting. Because I want to so much restrain myself from saying that by sitting with Raila Odinga is sitting with the nation, because Raila Odinga is not synonymous to the nation. But by nation, I mean that we would assume that Jubilee is already supporting him in whatever he's doing. Yes. Then the other half of the nation, as it were, based on the figures that we have. But then the nation will be sitting. And remember that the Constitution has domiciled a few good words in there about the executive office of president, that the president is the symbol of national unity. That symbolism must be just not be done by the president, but must be seen to be done by the president. He must be that symbol. Look, I have never seen any man diminished by extending a handshake or an olive branch. No one shall ever be diminished, not even President Kenyatta. In fact, history will domicile a place for him under the shade of respect. If at all he reaches out to Raila Odinga and asks him, brother, they have always called themselves brother before the cameras. Then can we see the color of that brotherhood? Instead of demonstrating especially in election times such as this, that they wear, like Joseph of Scripture, some, some costume with the technicolor, technicolors, and those many colors. We see the redness, the blueness, the greenness that actually we don't need as a nation. We need one color. And that is why, as I move expeditiously to the conclusion of my remarks before you move to Daktari, that President Kenyatta has got limited options. Actually, he's run out of options. Raila Odinga too, while he has got a bit of options because he has been emboldened by the lesser turnout in these elections. But what we demand as a people who call this our motherland, that this country needs leaders who can bring a people together. This is actually such a time.
All right, Dr. Mukwana, as much as Java says that nobody has been diminished by outstretching your hand for a handshake, politically speaking, it looks like that happens, but maybe it's timing that is of essence. Yesterday, after the president cast his ballot, he made a statement and said that he is willing to reach out to Raila Odinga and sit down and talk. But, of course, the question would be at the timing. And this may be because, for him, maybe he views it as an automatic win. If he is sworn in, would it be too little, too late for him to reach out? And what does that imply?
Michael, when you asked Javas a question by Honorable Uhuru sitting with Raila, will then...
Is he sitting with the nation?
And I thought your question was right. The answer was yes. And I'm glad he redeemed himself with very, very fast. Because those are the two halves of this nation.
Correct.
If you have ever doubted, yesterday is a manifest proof that indeed these two leaders represent half of the country. Michael, it will not be too little too late when the president extends his olive branch and say, my brother, let's work together. My only problem with the current leadership in this country is lack of respect, humility, and good manners. Every time, and I've always wondered what happened to the president. The president has been a thorough gentleman. In fact, if you've observed the president's language, he's very slow to ridicule. He has been very slow to ridicule and name call. Unlike the people around him, whom Javas calls the surrogates. Now, those people around him seem to be now infecting the president. So you find that, yes, as a head of state, when you say, I extend my olive branch, I expect him to pass that message even before he comes to tell the nation. I expect him to impress upon his people that that is what he wants in the nation. And therefore, his people must equally speak the same language, the language of respect, language of good manners. Because, remember, if you disrespect Raila, the effect is that his supporters lose you. If you disrespect Uhuru, the same happens. So whereas it's not too little too late, and I insist he has to do it, it is important that he does it differently. Instead of saying, today, I extend the olive branch. He said it when they were asking in the national prayers the other day. But in a span of 2-3 hours, once he's now on the campaign trail, what comes out completely flies in the face of what it is that he had said. So I still insist the president must go back to his old self, the dignified gentleman, the polished guy, who respects his colleagues and falls in equal measure, and reign upon his people, particularly those who are fighting and abusing people in public, to know that Raila is just not a nobody. You know, Michael, part of the reason why we have a problem in this country, that we stopped respecting our elders, and we stopped respecting people who had done so much for us. Today, Raila is the most decorated politician in Africa that you can do your studies. He's the most decorated, after Mandela, of course. But today, you find boys and girls who just went to Parliament the other day, literally in political diapers, hurling insults at Raila.
Charles, what does that say about our value system? Because as we go around this discussion, one is left wondering what exactly is going to be our resolve, what is going to be our solution. And what Dr. Mukwana is highlighting there is, first of all, disrespect to our elders. And this is not just in terms of age. Yeah. Elders, even in terms of where we are politically speaking as a democracy. But because our politics has been reduced, and again, I dare say, by our leaders, to a point where it's insults, what else do the younger politicians have to learn other than than just insult each other and, you know, carry on with that same lesson that they have learned from their elders. When we listen to our leaders, I mean, there's some things, as much as I, with much respect, say this about Raila, there's some things he also mentioned and lewd words which I would not even dare repeat in front of my children. When our leaders go to that low, what else do we expect, Charles?
Yeah, thank you. I think I agree what is being said here, but there is one part which I don't know if it's being conveniently avoided. The issue is we have men around the president who are misbehaving, but what are the men behind Raila Odinga doing? That is the question we need to ask ourselves, because it is the law of physics that action and reaction are equal and opposite. What is happening in our country is that it is not a culture of disrespect coming from one side. It is leaders across the board misbehaving.
Actually, I didn't. Sorry, Michael. In good faith,
Yeah.
I dwelt on the president and his people because that was the prompt that I received from the host.
Yeah.
I did not in any way appear to say that Raila surrogates also, as Javas called them, are not misbehaving. So I concentrated on what the question
because,
yeah. Right,
because it's important that we get the whole picture. Because when we look at it on one side, then the perception we create is that there is one side which has a legitimate platform of pontificating because they are moral, and the other totally lacks the moral platform. What we have in our country also is, apart from age and the respect for elderly statesmen and men, I consider Raila Odinga a decorated leader too, a champion of reform. But we also have a president who occupies the office of the presidency, the institution. So if at all you cannot calm yourself and respect the institution of the presidency, then you also have no moral latitude to come and question that you demand respect, yet you don't give it out. And then back to what my brother Java said, that it's good that our leaders speak, but importantly, you cannot shake hands with clenched fists. If I come to you and I want to speak to you and I extend to you an olive branch, you must be ready also and willing to accept that. But the tendency that we are seeing right now, and even where we are today as a country, is that the president has really been giving out, speaking to the nation variously. He's been giving this State of the Nation addresses. And one of the messages that has been consistent out of him is that there is the need for peace. He has come out as being mellow, not really abrasive. Of course, there are a few belligerents around him. But look also on the other side. We have already mutated a political formation into a resistance. And we are saying we resist, we disobey, and we do not regard in any way. So that is the question I want to ask is, how do you extend an olive branch, yet it is not ready to be received?
Javas, do we have an olive branch?
And just to finish, just to finish. There is the issue that I want to touch on, the issue of the numbers. You see, this election that we did is a repeat of August 8th. August 8th, the turnout was 79%. So 48% of the repeat poll makes it 60% of the people who turned out to vote on August 8 showed up to vote in this election. So there is also the need to disabuse the notion that this was not a national exercise. Because 60% of Kenyans, who turned out to vote in yesterday, are the ones who turned out to vote on August 8th. And when you look at even one of the most consequential elections in our country, the 2002 elections, which was the Rainbow Revolution, only 59%, 57% of Kenyans turned out to vote. There are other mitigating factors that affect an outcome of turnout in an election. But just to downplay the numbers and say these numbers were few, I think we'll be dishonest to ourselves. Kenyans turned out to vote. Okay. And there are issues like violence and intimidation, which really affected turnout and even restrained some people from exercising their rights. So it's also good when you look at one side of the coin, you flip it over and look at it.
And look at it from the other side. It's now 6 minutes to 8. This is Kivumbi 2017. For now, we want to release KTN Home. Life and Style is just about to begin. But right here on KTN News, we continue with this conversation. So those of us on KTN Home, goodbye. And those of you who would like to continue with us on this conversation or online, feel free to do so and switch over to KTN News. Jarvis, Charles has made a statement here that it's possible. All right, sorry. I think we need to take a break, then we'll be right back. But yeah, hold that thought right there. It's now 5 minutes to 8. And as we release KTN Home, we take a short break, but we'll be